Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church Sunday School Lesson number 4, Sunday, June 25th, 2017. The lesson is entitled Samson's Call. The lesson comes from Judges chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, and verses 24 through 25. We were asked to read Judges chapter 13, 1 through chapter 16, verse 31. The place is Zorah. The time is about 1050 BC. Our scripture text is quite brief, but you should read through the entire story of Samson in Judges 13:1 through 16:31. Many people with even passing knowledge of the Bible have heard of Samson, his legendary incredible strength, and the fact that it was conditioned on his never cutting his hair. They have heard of Delilah and how she seduced Samson to get his secret from him. We want to dig a little deeper into the story to see how God called Samson to a great work among his people, even before Samson was born. Today's aim, facts, to understand the details of this unusual call of Samson and its outcome. Principle, to see that God may employ other people in his call of a person. Application, to remind students to be open to the call of God and to allow him to work out the details over time. Illustrating the lesson, God may use others to reveal or confirm his call to us. Practical points. 1. God uses the ungodly to exact judgment on his people, and he uses the godly to deliver them. Judges 13:1 through 2. 2. Physical limitations do not impact the miraculous power of God. Verses 3. 3. God's promises require strict obedience. Verses 4 through 5. 4. It is important to respect God's messenger and receive the message that God has for us. Verses 6 through 7. 5. Obedience to God brings abundant blessings to our homes. Verses 24. 6. When God is with us, he will work through us. Verse 25. Golden text. Thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. Judges 13:5. Today we have two lesson outlines. The first is the announcement of Samson's birth, Judges 13:1 through 7. And the second is the early life of Samson, Judges 13:24 through 25. Introduction. Our God is infinitely innovative. Although he operates within the bounds of his revealed nature, his methods defy human expectation and predictability. He refuses to let us confine him to a box or pour him into a mold of our choosing. Thus, his calls to individuals for salvation or service are as unique as the individuals themselves. Since he has created us and kept us in his providential care, he suits each call to our personal traits and circumstances. Jesus' call to Simon Peter differed from that to Matthew or Nicodemus, and these differed from those to Cornelius, the Ethiopian eunuch, and Saul. The same creative approach is evident in God's call to individual judges. For example, he spoke to the outcast Jephthah through the desperate elders of Gilead. In this lesson, we discover still another approach. The Lord appeared to the mother and later both parents of Samson to instruct them on how their son was to be prepared for his work of deliverance. The announcement of Samson's birth, Judges 13:1. And the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines 40 years. Verse 2. And there was a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and bare not. Verse 3, and the angel of the Lord appeared unto the woman, and said unto her, Behold, now thou art barren, and bearest not, but thou shalt conceive, and bear a son. Verse 4, now therefore beware, I pray thee, and drink not wine nor strong drink, and eat not any unclean thing. Verse 5, for lo, thou shalt conceive, and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. Verse 6, then the woman came and told her husband, saying, a man of God came unto me, and his countenance was like the countenance of an angel of God, very terrible. But I asked him not whence he was, neither told he me his name. Verse 7, but he said unto me, Behold, thou shalt conceive, and bear a son, and now drink no wine nor strong drink, neither eat any unclean thing, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb to the day of his death. Israel's sin and punishment. Judges 13:1. Our passage begins with a dreary repetition of the theme that dominates Judges. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. No details are given here. They were supplied earlier in chapter 10, verse 6. The Israelites worshiped not only the Baalian and Ashtoreth, but also the gods of Syria, Zidon, Moab, Ammon, and the Philistines. This apostasy brought on both the Ammonite oppression of our last lesson and the Philistine oppression of this one, verse 7. These invasions probably took place simultaneously, the Ammonites attacking from the east and the Philistines from the west. But whereas the Ammonite invasion lasted 18 years, Judges 10:8, those of the Philistines lasted 40, 13:1. This is the longest foreign oppression recorded in Judges. The Philistines were distinct among the inhabitants of Canaan, neither Semitic like the Israelites, Moabites, Ammonites, or Edomites, nor Hamitic like the Canaanites. They came from Japhetic stock in Europe. Their original homeland was Sephtor, Jeremiah 47:4, Amos 9:7, which has been identified with Crete. It seems, therefore, that they had their roots in the Aegean Sea area. Isolated settlements of Philistines lived in Canaan in the patriarchal age, Genesis 21:32, 26:1. But the major migration occurred in the late 13th and early 20th century BC, when a huge influx of sea peoples from the west invaded eastern Mediterranean lands. The Philistines settled along Canaan's southern coastal plain and organized themselves into 5 city-states: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Joshua's conquest did not subdue the Philistines, though the lands apportioned to Judah and Dan included cities temporarily, Judges 1:18. But they were one of the peoples left in Canaan to test Israel, 3:1-3. Relations between them and the Hebrews proved unfriendly, as evidenced by Shamgar's daring encounter with them, verses 31. Now, however, vexation turned to outright domination. The tribes that felt it first were undoubtedly Judah, Simon, and Dan. It was probably the Philistine threat that induced the Danites to seek additional lands in the north, Judges 18:1-2. Samson's parents, Judges 13:2. In the midst of the Philistine oppression lived a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah. Manoah seems to have been an ordinary God-fearing Israelite who desired to know and do God's will. Verses 8 through 23. His wife, unnamed throughout this passage, was unable to bear children. Verse 2. And this must have brought grief to them. This text, along with many others, reminds us that when God chooses to do a great work, he often does so through weak and improbable persons. This situation he confronted with not only difficult but humanly impossible. Israel's deliverer would have to be brought into being through a miracle, then prepared for his work through a humble but godly upbringing. Through this, the Lord would reserve all the glory of the deliverance for himself. Manoah and his wife lived in Zorah, a town in Dan, about 15 miles west of Jerusalem near the Judean border, Judges 13:2. This was the heart of the territory attacked by the Philistines. The angel of the Lord's message, Judges 13:3 through 5. The angel who appeared to Manoah's wife was the same divine person who had earlier appeared to Gideon, chapter 6, verse 11, chapter 13, verses 21 through 22. He showed his omniscience by speaking of the woman's barrenness and condition considered a disgrace by any Hebrew woman. However, he quickly encouraged her with news that she would bear a son. These tidings in themselves would have been enough to gladden her, but the angel also informed her that her son would be special and that she would therefore have to prepare herself for this during her pregnancy. She was to abstain from wine and strong drink and refrain from eating anything unclean. The law of abstaining from unclean foods applied, of course, to all Israelites. Leviticus 11. But in light of her son's special role, Samson's mother had to be especially careful about contact with carcasses of animals, which could ceremonially defile a person. The restriction regarding drink related specifically to the rules under which her son was to live. The connection between mother and son was then spelled out. Thou shalt bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb. Judges 13:5. A Nazarite, sometimes spelled Nazirite, was one who was consecrated to the Lord by a vow. The laws governing the special relationships are given in Numbers 6:1 through 21. Nazarites had 3 distinguishing marks. First, they were to abstain from wine, not just wine. All fruit of the vine was prohibited, including fresh or dried grapes, Numbers 6:3 through 4. Second, they were not to cut their hair, verse 5. Third, they were to avoid contact with the dead, verses 6 through 7. If any of these requirements were violated, the vow was voided and the process would have to be started anew, verses 9 through 12. Normally, a Nazirite vow was undertaken voluntarily and for a specified length of time, concluded by a well-defined ceremony, Numbers 6:13 through 20. But in Samson's case, it would be neither. He was to be set apart as a Nazirite from birth. There would be 2 other biblical cases of a similar nature. Samuel, 1 Samuel 1:11, and John the Baptist, Luke 1:15. The woman was to dedicate her son in this way because he would be a divine instrument to begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. Judges 13:5. His role would be essential, yet it would be incomplete. He would weaken the Philistines by individual exploits, not military leadership. The full subjugation of the Philistines would come only through the further leadership of Samuel, Saul, Jonathan, and David. The Philistines continued to be a thorn to Israel for many years after Samson's lifetime. As it turned out, the only Nazirite requirement Samson seemed to take seriously was the one regarding his hair. He came into contact with many dead bodies, and it is almost certain that he drank wine at the wedding feast for his Philistine wife. But in his grace, God honored even this partial obedience through Samson's mighty deeds. The report of Samson's mother, Judges 13, 6 through 7. Manoah's wife immediately reported the angel's visit to her husband, but it became evident that she did not understand much that had happened. A man of God came unto me, she said. Man of God is the usual term for a prophet. 1 Samuel 9, 6, 1 Kings 12, 22, 13, 1, 2 Kings 23, 17, or for one who had a special relationship with God, such as Moses. Deuteronomy 33, 1, Joshua 14, 6. She had no other context in which to place this messenger, yet she knew there was something extraordinary about the man. She said his countenance was like the countenance of an angel of God, very terrible. Judges 13:6. The word translated terrible means awe-inspiring or fear-producing. Although she had never before seen an angel, this is what she thought an angel must look like. He looked human, but far exceeded a human being in the dignity of his appearance. As messengers of God, angels exude the glory of the one who has sent them. Luke 1:11 through 12, 2:9-24, 4 through 5. Manoah's wife could not be certain of the angel's identity, however. She said, I asked him not whence he was, neither told he me his name. Judges 13:6. In truth, she was probably too terrified to ask any questions, and he did not choose to reveal his identity. But the husband did not hesitate to ask when he appeared again later, verse 17. And although the visitor did not give a verbal answer, verse 18, his actions left no doubt that he was indeed the Lord himself, verses 19 through 22. Although the woman could not positively identify this messenger, she understood the message perfectly and reported it to her husband, Judges 13:7. She understood its implications for both herself and the son she would bear. Her abstinence from the items named was the beginning of her son's Nazirite vow, from the womb to the day of his death. It is an indication of Manoah's faith that he did not doubt anything his wife said. He did, however, pray that God's messenger would return and reveal to them how they were to bring up their son. Judges 13:8, a worthy request. Although the angel of the Lord did return, he merely repeated the instructions he had already given, verses 9 through 14. But he left the couple with a new reverence for God and a deepened sense of responsibility, verses 15 through 23. Samson's parents leave to us a fine example of faith and humility. Unlike Zacharias, John the Baptist's father, they demanded no sign that the supernatural birth would occur. Luke 1:18. They took God's word at face value, believing that he would perform what he promised. They asked only that they be given wisdom to rear their son properly. Then they bowed to his will, acknowledging that they were unworthy recipients of his grace. Judges 13:22 through 23. The early life of Samson, verse 24. And the woman bare a son, and called his name Samson. And the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. Verse 25. And the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp of Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. His birth, Judges 13:24a. Our text reports Samson's birth in a manner, and the woman bare a son, and called his name Samson. Yet behind this simple statement lie both the supernatural power of the Lord in making the birth possible and the woman's faith in his promise. It was an occasion of thanksgiving. Samson's name comes from the Hebrew word for son and may mean something like little son. This may have been a common name in that area. The town of Bethshemesh, house of the sun, was located nearby and may have been a center of Canaanite sun worship. There is no reason to believe, however, that pagan superstition was behind the naming of Samson. The Lord's blessing on him, Judges 13:24b through 25. As Samson grew to manhood, the Lord blessed him. This statement brings to mind similar statements about Samuel. 1 Samuel 3:19, John the Baptist, Luke 1:80, and Jesus 2:40 and 52. It implies a normal, healthy development in every area of life. Samson had advantages that Jephthah never had. His birth had been prophesied by the Lord. He had godly, loving parents, and he was dedicated to God as a Nazarite. The prospect for the future appeared bright. All the advantages of a godly heritage, however, do not guarantee success. A forward glance at Samson's career reveals that despite performing great exploits in God's name, he never reached his full potential. His undisciplined life was littered with numerous squandered spiritual opportunities. It stands as a reminder that every generation must reaffirm the faith of its fathers. God has no grandchildren. Nevertheless, Samson started out well, and the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. Judges 13:25. The word translated move means to stir or agitate. The Lord did not appoint him a commander of an army. He aroused him to individual exploits. We do not know the nature of these early deeds, but judging from the narrative that follows, they were probably feats of strength against the Philistines. These deeds occurred in a place called Manasseh Dan. Judges 18:22 literally rendered the camp of Dan in 13:25. A camp suggests a temporary dwelling place. This may have been the result of the Philistine threat, which drove Israelites from their homes. Chapter 6, verse 2. The place was located between the towns of Zorah and Eshtaol. Zorah was Samson's hometown. Chapter 13, verse 2. And Eshtaol was only a mile and a half northeast of it. So all of Samson's early deeds occurred near his home. Indeed, an examination of the later exploits of Samson reveals that he spent his whole life within a small area along the Dan-Judea border. The only forays outside this area were to Ashkelon, Judges 14:19, and Gaza 16:1. And his final imprisonment also was in Gaza, verse 21. His body was buried at his home next to his father's, verse 31. Samson's role as a deliverer was thus limited. He held the Philistines at bay for 20 years, preparing for the greater conquest of Saul and David. Our lesson reminds us that parents play a vital role in God's plan for children. They need to heed the Lord's instruction for themselves and pass on the knowledge of His will to the next generation. What their children do with the knowledge is their own responsibility. Questions. 1. What was the background of the Philistines? Where did they settle in Canaan? 2. What tribes were the first to feel the Philistine threat? 3. Where did Samson's parents live? What kind of people were they? 4. What message did the angel of the Lord bring to Manoah's wife? 5. What was a Nazarite? What were the 3 distinguishing characteristics of a Nazarite? 6. To what special role in Israel would Samson be called? 7. How did Manoah's wife describe the one who talked to her? 8. What worthy spiritual qualities did Samson's parents display? 9. What spiritual advantages did Samson have? How well did he utilize them? 10. In what geographical area did Samson carry out his deeds? This concludes the Sunday school lesson for Sunday, June 25th, 2017. Thank you for listening. God bless.